The sound of shattering glass pierced the still night air as Vivian Kendrick's trembling hands pushed open the small window of the remote cabin. Her heart pounding so fiercely she feared it might burst from her chest. Freedom was just inches away, but the consequences of being caught were unthinkable. Months of planning, waiting, and silent prayers had led to this desperate moment in the spring of 1876, deep in the untamed territory of Wyoming. Blood trickled down her palm where the broken glass had sliced her skin, but Vivian barely noticed the pain. The physical wounds were nothing compared to what she had endured these past 18 months as Alistair Blackwood's unwilling bride. Her so-called husband was due back from his hunting trip by dawn, and she knew in her bones that if she didn't escape tonight, she might never get another chance. At 22 years of age, Vivian had learned that beauty could be a curse as much as a blessing. Her chestnut hair and fine features had caught Alistair's eye when he'd visited Boston 2 years prior, and her father, facing financial ruin, had practically sold her to the wealthy frontier businessman, ignoring her tears and pleas. The cool night air rushed against her face as she squeezed through the window, her simple cotton dress catching on the frame. With a final push, she tumbled onto the hard ground, the smell of pine and earth filling her nostrils. For a moment, she lay still, listening for any sound that might indicate she'd been discovered. Only the distant howl of a coyote and the rustling of leaves in the breeze answered her. Gathering her meager belongings, a small pouch containing her mother's locket, the few coins she'd managed to hide away, and a bundle of dried jerky, Vivian rose to her feet. The vast wilderness stretched before her, intimidating in its darkness, but it offered something the cabin did not: hope. With one last glance at the prison that had been her home, Vivian disappeared into the night, guided only by the stars and the desperate prayer that someone, somewhere, might show her kindness in a world that had shown her none. For 3 days she walked, following a stream that she hoped would lead to civilization. She slept in shallow caves and under the shelter of large trees, jumped at every sound, and rationed her food until hunger gnawed at her insides like a savage beast. Her fine leather shoes, never meant for such a journey, fell apart on the second day, leaving her to continue barefoot over the rough terrain. By the third night, fever gripped her, and Vivian collapsed beneath a large cottonwood tree, certain that she had exchanged one death for another. The last thing she remembered before darkness claimed her was the distant sound of hoofbeats and the hope that it wasn't Alistair who had found her. "Miss, can you hear me, miss?" The voice penetrated the fog of Vivian's consciousness, deep and gentle with a slight drawl. She forced her heavy eyelids open to find herself staring into the most startlingly blue eyes she'd ever seen, set in a weathered, sun-bronzed face. "There you are," the man said, relief evident in his voice. "Thought we might lose you for a spell." Vivian tried to sit up, panic flaring as she realized she was in an unfamiliar room, lying on a simple but clean bed. Pain shot through her body and she winced. "Easy now," the man cautioned, placing a calloused hand on her shoulder. "You've been through quite an ordeal. Name's Jake Harrington. Found you half dead by Cottonwood Creek 3 days back." 3 days, Vivian's voice emerged as a hoarse whisper. Her throat felt like she'd swallowed sand. Jake nodded, reaching for a tin cup of water on the bedside table. "You've been fighting a fierce fever. Here, drink this." Vivian accepted the cup with trembling hands, studying her rescuer as she sipped the cool water. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms. His dark hair was slightly too long, and a shadow of stubble covered his jaw. He didn't look like a threat, but Vivian had learned the hard way that appearances could deceive. "Where am I?" she asked once her thirst was quenched, My ranch, about 20 miles east of Laramie. It's not much, but it's home." Jake took the empty cup from her. "Mind telling me what a lady like yourself was doing alone in the wilderness?" Vivian stiffened. "I was. Traveling." Jake's expression made it clear he didn't believe her, but he didn't press. "Well, you're safe now. My housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, has been looking after you. She's just gone to town for supplies." "I should go," Vivian said, attempting once more to rise. "I've imposed too much already." "Go where exactly?" Jake asked, his voice gentle but firm. "In your condition, you wouldn't make it half a mile. Besides, those feet of yours need time to heal." Glancing down, Vivian noticed her feet were bandaged. The memory of her painful journey flooded back. "I don't want to be a burden," she whispered, fighting back tears. Something in Jake's expression softened. "Miss, I don't know what you're running from, and you don't have to tell me. But I promise you this while you're under my roof. You've got nothing to fear." For the first time in almost 2 years, Vivian felt a flicker of genuine hope. There was something in this cowboy's steady gaze that made her want to believe him. "Vivian," she said after a moment. "My name is Vivian Kendrick." Jake smiled, and it transformed his rugged face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Well, Miss Vivian, welcome to Harrington Ranch. Rest now. We can talk more when you're stronger." As he left the room, Vivian sank back against the pillows. She knew she shouldn't trust this stranger, this cowboy with the kind eyes and gentle hands. But after the nightmare she'd escaped, trust was a luxury she couldn't afford to reject completely. For now, at least, she would accept his hospitality and pray that her past wouldn't find her here. Over the next week, Vivian's strength gradually returned. Mrs. Abernathy, a plump, gray-haired widow with a no-nonsense manner, tended to her needs with brisk efficiency. The older woman asked few questions, seeming to sense Vivian's reluctance to speak of her past. Jake visited each day, usually in the evening after his work was done. He'd sit in the chair beside her bed and tell her about his day, the new foal born in the stables, the fence mending on the north pasture, the progress of his small herd. His deep voice and simple stories became a comfort Vivian looked forward to. By the 8th day, she was able to walk to the window of her small room and look out at the ranch. Jake's not much was actually quite impressive: a sturdy 2-story main house, a large barn, stables, and fenced pastures stretching toward distant mountains. Several ranch hands moved about, tending to horses and cattle, thinking of making a run for it. Jake's voice came from the doorway, startling her. Vivian turned, managing a small smile. "Just admiring the view. Your ranch is beautiful. Been in my family for 2 generations, Jake said, stepping into the room. "My pa built it from nothing. I've been trying to make it grow since he passed 5 years back." "You've done well," Vivian observed. Jake shrugged modestly. "We get by. Mrs. Abernathy tells me you're well enough to join us for supper tonight if you feel up to it." The prospect of leaving the safety of her room made Vivian's anxiety flare, but she nodded. "I'd like that. I'm tired of these 4 walls." "Good. I'll have one of the hands bring up some hot water for washing up." He hesitated, then added, "I took the liberty of having Mrs. Abernathy pick up some things in town for you. Nothing fancy, but better than that torn dress you arrived in." Vivian flushed, suddenly aware of how she must have appeared when he found her. "That's very generous. I'll repay you as soon as I can." Jake waved away her offer. "No need. Consider it Western hospitality." An hour later, freshly bathed and dressed in a simple blue calico dress that Mrs. Abernathy had provided, Vivian made her way carefully down the stairs. Her feet were still tender, but the worst of the pain had subsided. The dining room was warm and inviting, with a large oak table set for 3. Jake stood when she entered, pulling out a chair for her. "You look much improved, Miss Kendrick," he said, his eyes appreciative but respectful. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington," she replied, settling into the chair. "And please call me Vivian." "Jake," he countered with a smile. Mrs. Abernathy bustled in with a steaming pot of stew, fresh bread, and a dish of butter. "About time you joined the land of the living," she said to Vivian, but her tone was kind. "A body needs proper food to heal, not just broth and tea." The meal was simple but delicious, and Vivian realized how hungry she was. As they ate, Jake kept the conversation light, telling stories about local characters and the upcoming summer cattle drive. He didn't ask about her past or why she had been alone in the wilderness, and Vivian was grateful for his discretion. After dinner, as Mrs. Abernathy cleared the dishes, Jake suggested they sit on the porch to enjoy the evening air. Vivian hesitated, glancing toward the open doorway with apprehension. "No one will harm you here," Jake said quietly, seeming to understand her fear. "My men are loyal, and strangers don't come calling without being noticed long before they arrive." Reluctantly, Vivian followed him onto the wide porch that wrapped around the front of the house. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. The vastness of the landscape took her breath away. "It's beautiful," she murmured, leaning against a post. "It grows on you," Jake agreed, settling into a rocking chair. "Took me a while to appreciate it after returning from back east." "You've been east?" Vivian asked, surprised. Jake nodded. "Spent 4 years at a university in Pennsylvania. My pa insisted. Said a man needs book learning as well as practical knowledge to succeed in changing times." "He sounds wise," Vivian said, taking the second rocker. "He was." Jake's voice held a note of sadness. "Would have liked to see what the ranch has become." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell and stars appeared in the vast Wyoming sky. The peacefulness of the moment was so at odds with the terror that had defined Vivian's recent life that tears unexpectedly welled in her eyes. Jake noticed but pretended not to, giving her time to compose herself. When she had wiped away the tears, he spoke without looking at her. "Vivian, I won't press you to share what you're not ready to, but I want you to know that whatever you're running from, you don't have to face it alone anymore." The sincerity in his voice broke something loose inside her. Before she could stop herself, the story poured out her father's financial troubles, her marriage to Alistair, the isolation and abuse she had suffered in that remote cabin. He would leave for days sometimes, hunting or on business. "He always locked me in," she said, her voice hollow with remembered fear. "The last time he forgot to secure one of the windows properly. I knew if I didn't take the chance, I might never get another." Jake remained silent throughout her tale, but his hands gripped the arms of his rocker so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Does he know where you might have gone?" he finally asked, his voice carefully controlled. Vivian shook her head. "I don't think so. I never mentioned anyone or any place specifically. He didn't like me to speak of my life before. And your father died 6 months after the wedding. There's no one left who would help me, even if they knew where I was." Jake was quiet for a long moment, then said, "You can stay here as long as you need. As my guest, or if you prefer, Mrs. Abernathy could use help with the house. Either way, you have a place here." "Why would you do that for a stranger?" Vivian asked, genuinely puzzled by his generosity. Jake's expression was solemn in the dim light from the house windows. "Because no one should live in fear, Vivian. And because I promised you'd never have to be afraid again. I mean to keep that promise." For the first time in longer than she could remember, Vivian felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She didn't know what the future held, but for now, she had found sanctuary. Days turned into weeks, and Vivian gradually settled into life at Harrington Ranch. True to her word, she insisted on earning her keep, helping Mrs. Abernathy with cooking and household chores. The older woman proved to be a patient teacher, showing Vivian how to manage a frontier household, skills her finishing school education had never included. As her confidence grew, Vivian began to venture beyond the main house. She discovered a small vegetable garden that had been neglected and set about restoring it, finding unexpected pleasure in the simple act of coaxing life from the soil. Jake noticed her interest and had one of his hands build her a proper fence to keep out rabbits and deer. Each evening, she and Jake would sit on the porch after dinner, talking until the stars came out. She learned about his dreams for the ranch, his years at university studying business and agriculture, his brief time in the Union Army at the end of the Civil War when he was barely 18. In turn, she shared stories of her childhood in Boston, her love of music and literature, the mother she had lost to consumption when she was 16. They carefully avoided discussing Alistair or what might happen if he tracked her down. But the possibility hung between them, an unspoken shadow that sometimes dampened their growing ease with one another. One afternoon in late June, Vivian was in the garden when she heard riders approaching. Heart pounding, she dropped her basket of vegetables and raced toward the house, certain that her past had finally caught up with her. Mrs. Abernathy met her at the kitchen door. "It's just the boys coming back from Laramie," she assured Vivian, recognizing her panic. "Mr. Jake sent them for supplies 3 days ago." Breathing deeply to calm herself, Vivian nodded. "Of course. I'm sorry for overreacting." The older woman's eyes softened with understanding. "No need to apologize, child. You've got good reason to be wary." Vivian helped unload the supplies when the ranch hands brought them to the kitchen. Among the usual flour, sugar, and coffee was a small package wrapped in brown paper with her name written on it. "Mr. Harrington said to give you that directly, madam," said young Tim, the newest and most shy of Jake's hired hands. Curious, Vivian unwrapped the package to find a book, a collection of poetry by Emily Dickinson. A simple note was tucked inside. "Thought you might enjoy this." The unexpected gift brought tears to her eyes. It had been so long since anyone had thought of her pleasure or comfort without ulterior motives. That Jake had remembered her mentioning her love of poetry during one of their evening conversations touched her deeply. That night, when they took their customary places on the porch, Vivian thanked him for the book. "It was nothing," Jake said, looking slightly embarrassed. "Just happened to see it in the general store when I was in town last week." "It meant a great deal to me," Vivian insisted. "To be thought of that way." Jake's eyes met hers and something unspoken passed between them. For a moment, Vivian thought he might reach for her hand, but he looked away, focusing on the distant mountains. "There's a town social next Saturday," he said after a pause. "Dancing, food, that sort of thing. Thought you might like to go if you're feeling up to it." The invitation surprised her. "Wouldn't people ask questions? About who I am, where I came from? Folks around here tend to mind their own business," Jake assured her. "But if you're worried, we could say you're my cousin from back east, staying while you recover from illness." Vivian considered the offer. Part of her longed for the normalcy of a social gathering, to be among people without fear. But another part, the part that still woke in the night drenched in sweat from nightmares of Alistair finding her, was terrified of being seen. "You don't have to decide now," Jake added, sensing her conflict. "Just think about it." Later that night, as Vivian prepared for bed, she caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the washstand. The gaunt, haunted face that had stared back at her when she first arrived at the ranch had been replaced by one with healthy color and clear eyes. Her hair, once dull with neglect, now shone as it fell in waves past her shoulders. More than the physical changes, though, She noticed a spark in her eyes that had been missing for nearly 2 years, a spark of life, of hope. She owed that transformation to Jake and the safety he had provided. Perhaps it was time to test that newfound strength, to step beyond the boundaries of the ranch and see if she could reclaim more of the woman she had once been. The next morning at breakfast, she told Jake she would attend the social with him. His answering smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "You won't regret it, Vivian. It'll do you good to see that not all of civilization is something to fear." As the day of the social approached, Vivian grew increasingly nervous. Mrs. Abernathy helped her alter one of her dresses, a simple green cotton that brought out the flecks of gold in her hazel eyes. The housekeeper even produced a pot of rice powder and a bit of rouge, treasures from her own youth that she kept for special occasions. "No sense in not looking your best," she told Vivian with a wink. "Might do Mr. Jake good to see you all prettied up." Vivian blushed at the implication. "Mrs. Abernathy, it's not like that between us." The older woman raised an eyebrow. "Maybe not yet, but I've seen how he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching, and how you look at him too." Had she been so transparent? Vivian wondered. It was true that her feelings for Jake had grown beyond simple gratitude, but she had been careful not to show it. A man like him deserved better than a woman with her baggage, her fears, her legal entanglements. For despite Jake's promise of safety, the truth remained in the eyes of the law. She was still Alistair Blackwood's wife. Running away didn't change that fact, no matter how justified her flight had been. Saturday arrived clear and warm. Jake had the wagon ready by mid-afternoon for the hour-long journey to town. He had dressed with care in clean dark trousers, a crisp white shirt, and a vest that matched his eyes. His usually unruly hair was neatly combed, and he'd trimmed his beard. He looked so handsome that Vivian felt a flutter in her stomach when she descended the stairs to meet him. The appreciation in his eyes when he saw her made the flutter intensify. "You look beautiful, Vivian," he said simply. "Thank you," she replied, suddenly shy. "You clean up quite well yourself, Cowboy." His laugh eased some of her tension, and they set off for town in good spirits. The journey passed quickly as Jake pointed out landmarks and shared stories about the area's early settlers. Laramie was larger than Vivian had expected, with proper streets, various businesses, and even a small schoolhouse. The social was being held in the town square, where tables had been set up around a cleared area for dancing. Lanterns hung from trees, waiting to be lit when darkness fell, and a small group of musicians was tuning their instruments on a makeshift stage. As they pulled up, Vivian's anxiety returned full force. What if someone recognized her? What if word somehow got back to Alistair? Jake seemed to sense her distress. He reached over and took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Remember, you're my cousin Vivian from Boston, recovering from a long illness. No one will question it," she nodded, drawing strength from his confidence. "Your cousin Vivian, I can remember that." As Jake had predicted, the townspeople were friendly but not overly curious. They welcomed her with the easy hospitality of the frontier, and if anyone thought it odd that Jake Harrington suddenly had a cousin staying with him, they were too polite to mention it. Vivian was introduced to so many people that their names and faces became a blur: the mayor and his wife, the school teacher, the blacksmith, the general store owner, various ranchers and their families. She smiled and chatted, gradually relaxing as the evening progressed. The food was plentiful and delicious: fried chicken, potato salad, cornbread, and various pies and cakes contributed by the women of the community. Vivian found herself genuinely enjoying the simple pleasure of a communal meal, something she had missed during her isolated months in Alistair's cabin. When the dancing began, Jake led her to the cleared area, "May I have this dance, cousin?" he asked with a teasing smile. "I'd be delighted," Vivian replied, placing her hand in his. The musician struck up a lively reel, and Jake proved to be a surprisingly graceful dancer for such a tall man. He guided her confidently through the steps, his hand warm and steady at her waist. Vivian couldn't remember the last time she had danced for pleasure rather than duty, and she found herself laughing as Jake twirled her. They danced several more times, with occasional breaks to rest and chat with townspeople. Vivian was speaking with the schoolteacher, Miss Winters, when she noticed a stranger watching her from across the square. He was a thin man with a pinched face, dressed in the dark suit of an Easterner rather than the practical clothing of the local men. A chill ran down Vivian's spine, though she couldn't say why. The man wasn't Alistair, nor did he resemble anyone she knew from her past life. Yet something about his focused attention disturbed her. "Are you all right, Miss Kendrick?" Miss Winters asked. Noticing her sudden discomfort, Vivian forced a smile. "Yes, just a bit tired. Who is that man in the dark suit? I don't believe we've been introduced." Miss Winters glanced in the direction Vivian indicated. "Oh, that's Mr. Palmer. He arrived in town about a week ago. Some sort of business with the railroad, I believe. Keeps to himself mostly." Vivian nodded, trying to dismiss her unease. It was natural that a newcomer would notice another newcomer, she told herself. Nothing sinister in that. But when she looked again, Mr. Palmer was speaking with the telegraph operator, their heads bent close in conversation. The operator glanced her way, then quickly looked away when he saw her watching. Anxiety bloomed in her chest. The telegraph was the fastest way for news to travel. If Alistair had put out word about his missing wife. "There you are," Jake's voice broke into her thoughts as he appeared at her side. "They're about to start the Virginia reel, and I've been saving my energy for it." Vivian managed a smile, though her heart was racing. "Actually, I'm feeling a bit tired. Would you mind terribly if we left early?" Concern immediately replaced Jake's cheerful expression. "Of course not. Are you unwell?" "Just overtired, I think. It's been a lovely evening, but perhaps I tried to do too much too soon." Jake didn't question her further, just offered his arm and made their excuses to those nearby. As they walked toward the wagon, Vivian felt eyes on her back but resisted the urge to turn and look. If Mr. Palmer was indeed watching her, she didn't want to confirm his interest. The ride home was quieter than their journey to town. Jake seemed to sense her need for silence, though she caught him glancing at her with worry several times. Finally, when they were about halfway back to the ranch, he asked, "Was it something more than tiredness, Vivian? Did someone say something to upset you?" She considered lying, dismissing her fears as mere paranoia, but Jake deserved better. "There was a man watching me, a Mr. Palmer, according to Miss Winters. Something about the way he looked at me. And then I saw him talking to the telegraph operator who also looked my way." Jake frowned. "Palmer, don't recall hearing that name before. Miss Winters said he arrived recently. Something to do with the railroad." "Could be innocent enough," Jake said, though his tone suggested he wasn't convinced. "Lot of railroad men passing through these days, surveying for new routes." "Perhaps," Vivian agreed, not wanting to seem hysterical. "It's probably nothing. My nerves getting the better of me." Jake reached over to take her hand. "Your nerves have kept you alive this long. Don't discount them." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "I'll have one of my men ride into town tomorrow, see what they can learn about this Palmer fellow. No harm in being cautious." His understanding, his willingness to take her fears seriously without judgment, made Vivian's throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you, Jake. I told you when you first came to the ranch you don't have to face things alone anymore." His hand tightened briefly around hers. "I meant it then, and I mean it now." In that moment, with the stars bright overhead and the steady rhythm of the horses' hooves beneath them. Vivian realized she had fallen in love with Jake Harrington. The knowledge was both wonderful and terrifying wonderful, because he was everything good and decent that Alistair was not. Terrifying, because loving him made her vulnerable in ways she had sworn never to be again. And more than that, loving him was complicated by truths she couldn't change, that in the eyes of the law, she belonged to another man, a man who would not let her go easily if he found her. The next morning dawned clear and hot, promising another scorching July day. Vivian woke early, her sleep having been disturbed by dreams of being hunted through endless forests. She dressed quickly and went downstairs to help Mrs. Abernathy with breakfast, hoping work would distract her from her lingering unease. Jake joined them shortly, his expression serious. "I'm sending Tim into town to ask around about Palmer," he told Vivian as he accepted a cup of coffee. "Told him to be casual about it, not raise suspicions." "Thank you," Vivian said, grateful for his concern even as she felt guilty for disrupting his household with her problems. "I hope I'm just being foolish." "Better foolish than careless," Mrs. Abernathy chimed in as she placed a platter of flapjacks on the table. "I've always believed in trusting your instincts." After breakfast, Jake headed out to check on a sick calf, promising to return by midday. Vivian busied herself with housework, though she found herself glancing frequently out the windows, half expecting to see riders approaching. It was nearly 2 o'clock when Tim returned, his young face flushed with exertion from riding hard in the summer heat. Vivian was in the kitchen, helping Mrs. Abernathy prepare vegetables for dinner when they heard him ride in. Both women went to the door, watching as Jake emerged from the barn to meet the young ranch hand. The two men spoke for several minutes, their expressions grave. Then Jake looked toward the house, his eyes finding Vivian's. Even from a distance, she could read the concern in his face. "That doesn't look good," Mrs. Abernathy murmured. Vivian's heart seemed to freeze in her chest. "No, it doesn't." Jake strode toward the house, his long legs covering the distance quickly. When he reached the porch, he addressed Mrs. Abernathy first. "Could you give us a moment, please?" The housekeeper nodded, patting Vivian's arm as she passed. "I'll be in the pantry if you need me, child." When they were alone, Jake gestured to the porch chairs. "Let's sit." Vivian obeyed, her legs suddenly weak. "It's bad news, isn't it?" Jake nodded, his expression grim. "Tim did some asking around. Your Mr. Palmer isn't with the railroad. He's a Pinkerton detective." The blood drained from Vivian's face. "Alistair hired him. Seems likely." According to the bartender at the hotel, Palmer's been showing a sketch of a woman to people around town. "A woman who matches your description." Vivian closed her eyes, fighting against the wave of terror that threatened to overwhelm her. "He's found me." "Not yet," Jake said firmly. "No one in town made the connection between the sketch and you. You've changed since you arrived here, healthier, different hairstyle, and they only know you as my cousin from Boston." "But it's just a matter of time," Vivian whispered. "If he stays in town, keeps asking questions, someone will eventually put it together." Jake leaned forward, taking her trembling hands in his. "Listen to me, Vivian. I'm not going to let him take you back to that man. We'll figure this out." "How?" Tears welled in her eyes. "The law is on his side, Jake. I'm his wife. He can claim me as his property and no court would side with me." "There are other ways," Jake insisted. "We could leave, go farther west, maybe to California or Oregon. Start fresh where no one knows either of us." His words stunned her. "We." "Jake, I can't ask you to abandon your ranch, your life here. This is your family's legacy." "It's just land and buildings," he said, his blue eyes intense. "What good is any of it if it means letting you go back to a life of fear and abuse?" The depth of feeling in his voice made her heart ache. "Why would you do that for me?" Jake's hands tightened around hers. "Because I love you, Vivian. I think I've loved you since that first night on this porch when you trusted me enough to tell me your story." For a moment, joy flared bright and beautiful within her. Then reality crashed back. "Oh, Jake," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I love you too, but that doesn't change the facts. I'm not free to love anyone." "We'll find a way," Jake insisted. "There must be grounds for divorce given what he did to you." Vivian shook her head sadly. "Even if there were, it would take time we don't have if the Pinkerton is already in Laramie." She pulled her hands away and stood, walking to the edge of the porch. "I should leave. Tonight. If I go alone, head south maybe, he'll follow me and leave you out of it." Jake was beside her in an instant, turning her to face him. "That's not happening, Vivian. I'm not letting you face this alone." The fierce protectiveness in his voice broke through her despair. For so long, she had been alone with her fears, her struggles. The realization that someone that Jake was willing to stand with her, to risk everything for her, was overwhelming. "What do we do?" she asked softly. Jake's expression turned thoughtful. "First, we need more information. Find out exactly what this Palmer knows, what evidence he has." "Tim said he's staying at the hotel in town. I'll ride in tomorrow, see what I can learn." "That's too dangerous," Vivian protested. "If he connects you to me, he won't," Jake assured her. "I've got business in town regularly, nothing unusual about me being there. In the meantime, you stay close to the house. Mrs. Abernathy and the hands will keep an eye out for strangers." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than running blindly or waiting helplessly for discovery. Vivian nodded her agreement. "We'll get through this," Jake promised, drawing her into his arms. "Together." Pressed against his solid warmth, Vivian wanted desperately to believe him. But as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the land, she couldn't shake the feeling that their time was running out. The next morning, Jake rode into town alone, despite Vivian's continued misgivings. He dressed, as he normally would for a trip to Laramie, practical clothing. No gun belt that might suggest he was expecting trouble. Only the set of his jaw betrayed his tension as he mounted his favorite bay gelding. "I'll be back by supper time," he promised Vivian, who stood on the porch watching him prepare to leave. "Stay close to the house, and remember what we discussed." What they had discussed late into the previous night was a contingency plan if Jake didn't return by dark. Vivian was to take the small bag they had packed, along with one of the faster horses, and ride north toward the homestead of Jake's friend, a former trapper named Isaac Jenkins, who lived in near isolation in the foothills. "Be careful," Vivian said, fighting the urge to beg him to stay. "Don't take unnecessary risks." Jake's expression softened as he looked down at her from his saddle. "I'll be discreet. Just gathering information today, nothing more." With a final nod, he turned his horse and rode out, following the worn trail that led toward town. Vivian watched until he disappeared from sight, then went inside to help Mrs. Abernathy with the day's chores, hoping work would keep her mind from dwelling on all the things that could go wrong. The day crawled by with agonizing slowness. By mid-afternoon, Vivian had cleaned every surface in the kitchen twice, mended a pile of shirts that had been waiting for attention, and was reduced to pacing anxiously by the front windows, watching the road for any sign of riders. "You'll wear a hole in my floor with that pacing," Mrs. Abernathy commented as she came in from the garden with a basket of fresh vegetables. "Mr. Jake can take care of himself. He was a soldier, remember." "I know," Vivian sighed, forcing herself to sit down. "I just wish there was something more I could do besides wait." The older woman's expression softened with sympathy. "Waiting is often the hardest part, but sometimes it's all we can do." She set down her basket and took the chair opposite Vivian. "He loves you, you know." "I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." Vivian's heart twisted. "I love him too. That's why I'm so afraid, if anything happens to him because of me." "That man makes his own choices," Mrs. Abernathy said firmly, "and he's chosen to stand by you. That's a rare thing in this world, someone willing to risk everything for love." She patted Vivian's hand. "Now, come help me with these vegetables. Keeping busy is the best cure for worry." Vivian nodded and followed the housekeeper back to the kitchen, grateful for the woman's no-nonsense wisdom and the distraction of work. It was nearly dusk when they heard the sound of an approaching horse. Vivian rushed to the window, her heart in her throat, then sagged with relief when she recognized Jake's tall form on his bay gelding. She was out the door and down the porch steps before he had fully dismounted. Jake handed the reins to one of the ranch hands who had come to take his horse, then turned to Vivian with a reassuring smile. "Everything's all right," he said before she could speak. "Let's go inside. I've got news." In the privacy of Jake's study, with the door closed against curious ears, he shared what he had learned in town. "I managed to get a look at Palmer's notes when he was having lunch at the hotel restaurant," Jake explained, settling into his desk chair while Vivian perched on the edge of a leather armchair. "Blackwood hired him a month ago to find you. He's been following your trail from Wyoming territory through Colorado and back up here." "Did the notes say anything about why Alistair wants me back?" Vivian asked, dreading the answer. Jake's expression darkened. "Nothing specific. But there was mention of a substantial bonus if Palmer brings you back unharmed. And—" He hesitated. "And," Vivian prompted, "and a note that Blackwood will be arriving in Laramie next week to oversee the final search himself." The room seemed to tilt around Vivian. "Alistair is coming here." "Next week," Jake nodded grimly. "According to Palmer's telegram correspondence, Blackwood leaves Boston in 2 days. It'll take him about 5 days to reach Laramie by train." "Then I have to leave," Vivian said, rising from her chair. "Tonight." "If I'm gone before he arrives, sit down, Vivian," Jake said, his voice gentle but firm. "Running isn't the answer, not this time." "Then what is?" she demanded, fear making her voice sharp. "Wait for him to find me. Let him drag me back to that prison of a cabin." "No." Jake's eyes held her steadily. "We fight, legally." Vivian laughed bitterly. "Legally, Jake, he's my husband. The law gives him every right to me. Not if the marriage wasn't legal in the first place." She stared at him, uncomprehending. "What do you mean?" Jake leaned forward, his expression intense. "Think, Vivian. You said your father arranged the marriage when he was facing financial ruin. Was Blackwood involved in your father's business?" "Yes," she said slowly, memories surfacing. "Alistair was one of his investors. When the business began to fail, he offered to forgive the debts if my father would convince me to marry him." "And did your father owe him a great deal?" Vivian nodded. "Almost everything. The business, our home. It would all have been lost." "So Blackwood essentially purchased you by forgiving those debts," Jake said, a note of triumph in his voice. "That's coercion, Vivian. In some jurisdictions, it could be grounds to have the marriage annulled or at least to grant a divorce." Hope flickered briefly, then died. "But we'd need proof." "Documents, witnesses. My father is dead, and any papers were left behind in Boston." "Not necessarily," Jake countered. "While I was in town, I sent telegrams to 2 contacts from my university days. One now practices law in Boston. The other works at a bank there. If there were financial transactions related to your marriage, there will be records." Vivian stared at him, amazed at his foresight. "You did all that today?" He nodded. "And I spoke with Judge Wilson, who happens to be in Laramie this week for circuit court." Without mentioning names, I laid out a hypothetical situation similar to yours. He agreed that if evidence of coercion or fraud could be produced, it would create legal grounds for challenging the marriage. For the first time since learning of Palmer's presence in Laramie, Vivian felt a flicker of genuine hope. "Do you really think it could work?" "I think it's worth fighting for," Jake said, reaching across the desk to take her hand. "But we need to act quickly. My contacts in Boston will need time to gather evidence, and we need to be prepared before Blackwood arrives. What do we do in the meantime, if Palmer connects me to you before we have what we need?" "I've thought of that too," Jake said. "Tomorrow you and Mrs. Abernathy will travel to my sister's place in Cheyenne. Sarah is expecting you. You'll be safer there while I finish gathering what we need here." The thought of leaving Jake made Vivian's chest tighten with anxiety, but she recognized the logic in his plan. "How long will I need to stay there?" "A few days at most, just until I've secured the evidence and spoken with the judge again." Jake squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Sarah knows the situation, not all the details, but enough to understand the importance of keeping your presence quiet." Vivian nodded slowly, processing the plan. It wasn't perfect, but it offered a path forward that didn't involve either running forever or surrendering to Alistair. "All right, I'll go to Cheyenne." Relief crossed Jake's face. "Good. Mrs. Abernathy already has instructions. You'll leave at first light, taking the southern route to avoid passing through Laramie." As they discussed the final details of her departure, Vivian marveled at how thoroughly Jake had thought through everything in just one day. He had resources she hadn't anticipated, connections from his university days that extended far beyond this remote Wyoming ranch. Most importantly, he had given her something she had almost forgotten how to feel: hope. That night, as she packed the few belongings she would take to Cheyenne, Vivian allowed herself to imagine a future where she was truly free to love Jake openly, to build a life with him on this land that he loved so much. It was a dangerous dream, one that could be shattered if their plan failed. But for the first time in years, it felt possible. The journey to Cheyenne took most of the day, following back roads and trails to avoid the main thoroughfares where they might be observed. Mrs. Abernathy proved to be surprisingly resilient for her age, maintaining a steady pace and offering quiet encouragement when Vivian's nerves threatened to overwhelm her. Sarah Harrington Wells lived on the outskirts of Cheyenne with her husband, a local doctor, and their 2 young children. She greeted Vivian with the same direct warmth that characterized her brother, making it clear that any friend of Jake's was welcome in her home. "He's told me enough to understand that you're in trouble, and that secrecy is important," Sarah said as she showed Vivian to a comfortable guest room. "No one will know you're here except family." "Thank you," Vivian said, touched by the woman's immediate acceptance. "I don't know how to repay such kindness." Sarah's smile was remarkably like her brother's. "Jake says you've brought life back to that old ranch house. That's payment enough for me. I've been telling him for years he needs more than cattle and horses for company." Over the next 3 days, Vivian found herself welcomed into the rhythm of the Wells household. Sarah's children, 8-year-old Thomas and 6-year-old Emily, quickly adopted her as a favorite playmate, and Dr. Wells proved to be as kind and steady as his wife. No one pressed her for details about her past, though Vivian sensed that Sarah had guessed much of the truth. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, a telegram arrived from Jake. Sarah brought it to Vivian, who was helping Emily practice her letters in the garden. "News from the ranch," Sarah said, handing over the yellow paper. With trembling fingers, Vivian unfolded the message. "Evidence secured. Stop. Judge agrees to hear case. Stop. Returning tomorrow with documents. Stop. All well at ranch. Stop." Jake relief swept through her so powerfully that she had to sit down on the garden bench. "He's found what we need," she told Sarah. "He's coming tomorrow." Sarah squeezed her shoulder gently. "I told you my brother wouldn't let you down when Jake commits to something or someone he sees it through." That night, Vivian slept more soundly than she had since fleeing Alistair's cabin. The knowledge that Jake had secured evidence, that a judge was willing to hear their case, eased the constant fear that had been her companion for so long. She woke the next morning feeling almost hopeful, joining the family for breakfast with a lighter heart than she had felt in days. Dr. Wells had already left for his practice in town, but Sarah and the children were at the table when Vivian came downstairs. "Jake should be here by midday," Sarah told her as she poured coffee. "William left early to meet with a patient, but he'll be back for dinner. I thought we might celebrate tonight quietly, of course." The morning passed slowly as Vivian helped Sarah with household chores and played with the children. Every hoofbeat on the road made her heart leap with anticipation, only to fall again when it proved to be a passing neighbor or delivery wagon. It was just past noon when they heard riders approaching several horses, moving fast. Sarah went to the window, her expression shifting from expectation to concern. "That's not Jake," she said, turning to Vivian with alarm. "It's 3 men I don't recognize. One's dressed like an Easterner." Cold dread washed over Vivian. "Palmer and Alistair, he must have arrived early." Sarah reacted with decisive speed. "Upstairs now. There's a storage space in the attic behind the chimney. Thomas will show you." The little boy, sensing the urgency, took Vivian's hand and pulled her toward the stairs. "Come on, Miss Vivian. It's where we hide during hide and seek. No one ever finds us there." As they climbed the stairs, Vivian heard Sarah instructing Emily to continue her reading at the kitchen table, acting as if nothing was amiss. Then came the sound of knocking at the front door, and Sarah's measured footsteps crossing to answer it. Thomas led Vivian up a narrow set of steps to the attic, then to a small door built into the wall beside the chimney. It opened to reveal a space barely large enough for a person to sit comfortably, likely designed as extra storage. "In here," Thomas whispered. "Don't make any noise. I'll come get you when it's safe." Vivian squeezed into the cramped space, and Thomas closed the door, leaving her in near darkness except for thin lines of light coming through the cracks. She could hear muffled voices from below but couldn't make out what was being said. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as she sat in the confined space, trying to control her breathing and the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. Had Alistair somehow discovered Jake's plan? Had Palmer managed to track her to Sarah's house? And where was Jake? The questions circled in her mind like vultures, offering no answers, only deepening her fear. She lost track of how long she had been hiding when she finally heard footsteps on the attic stairs. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain it would give away her position. "Miss Vivian." Thomas's voice came through the door, soft but clear. "Mama says it's safe now. They're gone." Relief made her limbs weak as she pushed open the small door and crawled out, stretching her stiff muscles. "What happened? Who were they?" Thomas shrugged. "Mama just said to tell you they're gone and to come downstairs." Sarah was waiting in the kitchen, her face pale but composed. "It was him," she confirmed as soon as Vivian entered. "Your husband. And 2 others, the detective Palmer and a local deputy he's somehow convinced to help him." Vivian sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. "What did they want?" "They're looking for you, of course. Palmer claimed to have information that Jake was harboring a runaway wife, his words, not mine." Sarah's disgust was evident in her tone. "They wanted to search the house, but I refused without a proper warrant. The deputy backed me up on that at least. Law's still the law, even out here." "Did they mention Jake? Is he all right?" Sarah nodded. They said nothing about Jake directly, but Blackwood made it clear he wouldn't stop looking. He plans to visit every friend and associate of Jake's in the territory if necessary. Then I have to leave, Vivian said, rising again. If he's searching this systematically, it's only a matter of time before he finds me. I can't put your family at risk. You're not going anywhere, Sarah said firmly. Not until Jake gets here with those documents. We just need to hold out a little longer. As if summoned by her words, they heard the distinctive sound of a single horse approaching at a gallop. Sarah moved to the window, then sagged with relief. It's Jake. Moments later, Jake burst through the door, his face tight with concern that melted into relief when he saw Vivian. Thank God, he breathed. When I heard in town that Blackwood was already here and asking questions, I feared the worst. He was here, Sarah told him. About an hour ago with Palmer and a deputy. They wanted to search the house. Jake's expression darkened. Did they have a warrant? No. I refused and the deputy didn't push it. But they'll be back, Jake. Blackwood doesn't strike me as a man who gives up easily. He isn't, Vivian confirmed, remembering all too well Alistair's implacable determination. Once he decides he wants something, he'll do whatever it takes to get it. Jake crossed to her, taking her hands in his. Well, he's not getting you. I have what we need. He pulled a leather portfolio from his saddlebag. Financial records showing that Blackwood systematically ruined your father's business to force him into debt, then used that debt as leverage to coerce your marriage. Plus affidavits from 2 of your father's former business partners testifying to the same. Vivian stared at the portfolio in disbelief. How did you get all this so quickly? My friends in Boston came through. Turns out Blackwood has made enemies over the years, people who were more than happy to help build a case against him. Jake's smile was grim but satisfied. Judge Wilson has agreed to hear our petition first thing tomorrow morning. If he rules in our favor, Blackwood will have no legal claim on you. Hope warred with fear in Vivian's heart. And if the judge rules against us, Jake's eyes met hers steadily. Then we'll find another way. I'm not letting him take you, Vivian. Not now, not ever. The conviction in his voice steadied her, reminding her that she was no longer alone in this fight. What do we do now? We need to get you to Laramie tonight so you can appear before the judge tomorrow. Jake turned to his sister. Sarah, can you lend us your covered wagon? It'll attract less attention than riders on horseback. Sarah nodded. Of course. William can drive you. As a doctor, he has more freedom to travel at odd hours without raising suspicion. We'll leave after dark, Jake decided. Blackwood and Palmer will likely be watching the main roads during daylight, but they'll have to rest sometime. As Sarah went to prepare food for their journey and send word to her husband, Jake pulled Vivian into his arms, holding her close. I was so afraid when I heard Blackwood had arrived early, he murmured against her hair. If anything had happened to you. I'm all right, she assured him, drawing strength from his solid presence. Sarah was quick thinking. They never knew I was here. Jake pulled back slightly to look into her eyes, his expression serious. Tomorrow, one way or another, this ends. You'll be free of him, Vivian, I promise. She wanted desperately to believe him. But as they prepared for the night journey to Laramie, Vivian couldn't shake the feeling that Alistair would not surrender so easily. He had tracked her across hundreds of miles, hired a Pinkerton detective, and arrived in Wyoming ahead of schedule. He would not be deterred by legal documents or a frontier judge's ruling. And if the law failed them, what then? Would Jake truly be willing to abandon everything he had built here to run with her? And could she bear the guilt of knowing he had sacrificed his family's legacy for her sake? These questions haunted her as darkness fell, and they prepared to leave for Laramie, where her fate and their future would be decided. The journey to Laramie in Dr. Wells's covered wagon was tense but uneventful. They took back roads and cattle trails, avoiding the main thoroughfares where Alistair and his men might be watching. Jake rode alongside on horseback, constantly scanning their surroundings for any sign of pursuit. They reached the town just before dawn, the streets quiet except for a few early risers heading to work. Dr. Wells drove them directly to the home of Judge Wilson, a modest clapboard house on the edge of town. "The judge is expecting us," Jake explained as he helped Vivian down from the wagon. He agreed it would be safer to meet here rather than at the courthouse, given the circumstances. Judge Wilson proved to be an elderly man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner. He invited them into his study, where a small breakfast was laid out on a side table. "Eat something," he instructed as he took his seat behind a large oak desk. Court proceedings require stamina, even informal ones. While they ate, Jake presented their case, laying out the evidence he had gathered from Boston financial records, affidavits and correspondence that painted a damning picture of Alistair Blackwood's manipulation of Vivian's father and the coercive nature of the marriage arrangement. The judge listened without interruption, occasionally examining a document more closely or making notes. When Jake finished, he turned his attention to Vivian. "Young woman, I need to hear from you directly. Were you forced into this marriage against your will?" Vivian swallowed hard, then nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. My father was facing complete financial ruin. Mr. Blackwood offered to forgive his debts if I agreed to the marriage. I was told I had no choice if I wanted to save my family from destitution." "And after the marriage, what was the nature of your relationship with Mr. Blackwood?" The question made her flinch, memories of Alistair's cruelty flooding back. He was not kind, Your Honor. He kept me isolated in a remote cabin, rarely allowed me contact with others. When I displeased him, he would lock me in for days at a time." She hesitated, then forced herself to continue. "There were times when he used physical force to ensure my compliance." The judge's expression remained neutral, but his eyes hardened. "And your escape, how did that come about?" "He left on a hunting trip. One of the windows was improperly secured. I took the opportunity and fled into the wilderness." Judge Wilson nodded, making another note. Then he looked up at Jake. "Mr. Harrington, your involvement in this matter is personal." Jake met the judge's gaze steadily. "Yes, Your Honor. I found Miss Kendrick near death on my property after her escape. I've come to care for her deeply. My interest is in seeing her free to determine her own future, whatever that may be." The older man studied them both for a long moment, then sighed heavily. "The evidence you've presented is compelling. Under normal circumstances, I would have no hesitation in granting an annulment on grounds of coercion and fraud." Vivian's heart sank at his use of would. "But," she prompted softly, "but Mr. Blackwood is currently in my jurisdiction, and basic fairness requires that he be given an opportunity to respond to these allegations." The judge held up a hand as Jake began to protest. "However, given the nature of your claims and the evidence of potential danger to Miss Kendrick, I am willing to issue a temporary restraining order prohibiting Mr. Blackwood from approaching or attempting to remove her while the matter is under consideration." It wasn't the immediate freedom they had hoped for, but it was protection, legal protection that even Alistair would be hesitant to violate openly. "How long will the consideration take?" Jake asked, clearly trying to contain his frustration. "I can schedule a formal hearing for tomorrow morning. Mr. Blackwood will be notified and given the opportunity to present his side. After that, I will make my ruling." The judge's expression softened slightly. "For what it's worth, Mr. Harrington, based on what I've seen thus far, I believe Miss Kendrick has a strong case." As they left the judge's home an hour later, restraining order in hand, Vivian felt oddly conflicted. The legal protection was reassuring, but the knowledge that she would have to face Alistair in court the next day filled her with dread. "What now?" she asked Jake as they thanked Dr. Wells and prepared to continue on their own. "We need a safe place to stay until the hearing," Jake replied. "Somewhere Blackwood won't think to look." "The church," Dr. Wells suggested. "Pastor Thomas is a good man, and the church has a small room at the back used for visiting preachers. It would be the last place someone would search for fugitives." Jake nodded his agreement. "Perfect. Can you speak to him for us, William? The fewer people who see Vivian in town, the better." Dr. Wells drove them to the small wooden church on the outskirts of town, where Pastor Thomas, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a ready smile, welcomed them without question, once the situation was explained. "The Lord's house is a sanctuary for all who seek protection," he said simply, showing them to a modest but clean room behind the church office. "You'll be safe here until your hearing." Left alone at last, Vivian sank onto the narrow bed, exhaustion catching up with her. Jake took the room's only chair, watching her with concern. "You should rest," he said gently. "Tomorrow will be difficult." Vivian nodded, though she doubted sleep would come easily. "What do you think will happen?" At the hearing, Jake's expression grew serious. "Blackwood will fight. He'll deny everything, try to paint you as unstable or ungrateful. But the evidence is strong, Vivian. And Judge Wilson struck me as a man who sees through deception. And if he rules in our favor, what then?" A soft smile touched Jake's lips. "Then you'll be free to decide your own future." "With you?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Jake moved from the chair to sit beside her on the bed, taking her hands in his. "If that's what you want. I love you, Vivian. I want to build a life with you on the ranch if you like it there, or somewhere else if you prefer. All that matters to me is that we're together and that you're happy and safe." Tears welled in her eyes at the sincerity in his voice. "I love you too, Jake, more than I ever thought possible. The ranch. It feels like home now, more than Boston ever did." He reached up to brush a tear from her cheek, his touch infinitely gentle. "Then that's where we'll be. Once this is over, once you're truly free." Vivian leaned into his touch, drawing strength from his unwavering belief that they would prevail. Tomorrow she would face Alistair, confront the man who had made her life a living nightmare. The thought terrified her, but with Jake beside her, she found the courage to hope for a future beyond fear. Morning came too quickly. Vivian had managed a few hours of restless sleep, comforted by Jake's presence in the chair beside her bed. He had refused to leave her alone, even for a moment, fearing that Alistair might somehow discover their hiding place. Pastor Thomas brought them breakfast and fresh water for washing, along with the news that Judge Wilson had sent official notification of the hearing to the hotel where Alistair was staying. "It's set for 10 o'clock at the courthouse," the pastor informed them. "The judge has arranged for a private entrance, so you won't have to walk through the main doors where you might be seen." Jake thanked him for the information and his hospitality. As the pastor left to prepare for his morning duties, Vivian found herself unable to eat, her stomach knotted with anxiety. "You need to keep up your strength," Jake urged, noticing her untouched plate. "I don't think I can," she admitted. The thought of seeing him again, of being in the same room with him. Jake moved to kneel in front of her chair, taking her hands in his. "Listen to me, Vivian. He can't hurt you anymore. Not legally, not physically. I'll be right beside you the entire time. And if he so much as looks at you wrong, he'll answer to me." The fierce protectiveness in his voice steadied her. "I'm just afraid that somehow he'll convince the judge, that he'll find a way to take me back." "That's not going to happen," Jake insisted. The evidence is clear, and Judge Wilson has already seen enough to issue the restraining order. He's not easily fooled. Vivian nodded, trying to draw strength from Jake's confidence. You're right. I need to be brave just a little longer. You're the bravest person I know, Jake said, his blue eyes intense with admiration. To survive what you did, to escape on your own, to keep fighting. That takes a courage most men I know couldn't match. His words warmed her, reminding her that she was no longer the frightened girl who had arrived in Wyoming as Alistair's bride. She had survived, escaped, found her way to safety to Jake. She could face this final challenge. At 9:30, they left the church through a back door, following a narrow alley that led toward the courthouse. Jake had arranged for one of his ranch hands, who had ridden into town that morning, to meet them at the private entrance Judge Wilson had designated. The courthouse was a modest 2-story building of red brick, the largest structure in Laramie aside from the new railroad station. The side entrance led directly to a small anteroom where an elderly clerk was waiting for them. Judge Wilson asked me to show you in when you arrived, he explained, leading them through a narrow corridor to the judge's chambers. He'll speak with you briefly before the hearing begins. The judge was at his desk, reviewing papers that Vivian recognized as the evidence Jake had presented the previous day. He looked up as they entered, his expression grave. Miss Kendrick, Mr. Harrington, please sit. He gestured to the chairs in front of his desk. I wanted a moment with you before we proceed. Mr. Blackwood has arrived with legal representation, a Mr. Finch from Denver, apparently a well-regarded attorney in that city. Jake frowned. We weren't expecting him to have counsel. It's not unusual in cases of this nature, the judge said. But it does mean the proceedings may be more contentious than we anticipated. Mr. Finch has already filed a motion to dismiss your petition on jurisdictional grounds, arguing that since the marriage took place in Massachusetts, only a court there has authority to dissolve it. Vivian's heart sank. Does that mean we have to go to Boston to fight this? Judge Wilson shook his head. No, I've denied the motion. While there's some merit to the argument, the fact that both parties are currently within my jurisdiction, and the allegations involve actions that occurred here in Wyoming territory, gives me sufficient authority to hear the case. Relief flooded through Vivian. Thank you, Your Honor. The judge's expression remained serious. Don't thank me yet, Miss Kendrick. This hearing will not be pleasant for you. Mr. Blackwood and his attorney will likely challenge every aspect of your testimony. They may make accusations designed to undermine your character or credibility. Are you prepared for that? Vivian swallowed hard, then nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I've lived with the truth for 2 years. I can speak it for 1 day. A flicker of approval crossed the judge's face. Very well. One more thing, I've decided to hold this hearing in my chambers rather than the open courtroom. Given the sensitive nature of the allegations and the emotional dynamics involved, I believe it will be more conducive to finding the truth. We appreciate that, Your Honor, Jake said. The judge rose. Then let's proceed. Mr. Blackwood and his attorney are waiting in the adjoining room. Remember, Miss Kendrick, speak the truth plainly and directly. That's all I require. Vivian's legs felt weak as she stood, but Jake's steady presence beside her gave her courage. As the judge led them into a larger room set up with a table and chairs, she kept her eyes fixed on the floor, not yet ready to face the man who had haunted her nightmares for so long. All rise for the Honorable Judge Wilson, presiding in the matter of Kendrick versus Blackwood, the clerk announced formally. There was a shuffling of feet and chairs as everyone stood, then sat again at the judge's direction. Only then did Vivian force herself to look across the table at Alistair Blackwood. He was, as she remembered, tall and lean, with sharp features and cold gray eyes. His dark hair was immaculately groomed, his expensive suit perfectly tailored. To anyone who didn't know him, he appeared the very model of Eastern refinement and respectability. But Vivian knew what lay beneath that polished exterior. As their eyes met, she saw the flash of possessive rage in his gaze, quickly masked behind a facade of injured dignity. Beside him sat a portly man in an equally fine suit, Mr. Finch, presumably arranging papers with practiced efficiency. This hearing will address the petition filed by Vivian Kendrick for annulment of her marriage to Alistair Blackwood on grounds of coercion and fraud, Judge Wilson began, his voice stern and formal. Mr. Harrington has been permitted to assist Miss Kendrick, as she has no formal legal representation. I remind everyone present that this is a search for truth, not a platform for theatrics or personal vendettas. His gaze lingered pointedly on Alistair before continuing. Miss Kendrick will present her case first, followed by Mr. Blackwood's response. I will then rule based on the evidence and testimony presented. Vivian took a deep breath, then began to speak. With as much composure as she could muster, she recounted the circumstances of her marriage, her father's financial troubles, Alistair's manipulation, the implicit threat of destitution if she refused. She described the isolation of the cabin, the controlling behavior that had escalated to physical abuse, and finally, her desperate escape. Throughout her testimony, Alistair's expression remained one of pained disbelief, occasionally shaking his head as if saddened by her distortions. His attorney took copious notes, interrupting occasionally with objections that the judge mostly overruled. When she finished, Jake presented the documentary evidence, the financial records showing Alistair's systematic undermining of her father's business, the affidavits from former business associates, even a letter from her father to a friend expressing his anguish at selling his daughter's happiness to save his own skin. Mr. Finch then rose for cross-examination, his manner deceptively gentle. Miss Kendrick, isn't it true that you accepted Mr. Blackwood's proposal willingly in front of witnesses at your father's home in Boston? I said the words, Vivian admitted. But only because I had been told there was no alternative if my family was to survive. And during your marriage, did my client not provide you with every comfort? A home, clothing, food, protection in the wilds of Wyoming territory. Vivian's hands clenched in her lap. He provided a prison, sir. A comfortable one at times, perhaps, but a prison nonetheless. A rather dramatic characterization, Finch commented with a patronizing smile. Isn't it more accurate to say that you, a sheltered Boston girl, simply found frontier life more difficult than you anticipated? That you grew homesick and resentful? No, Vivian said firmly. I found being locked in a cabin while my husband was away difficult. I found being struck when dinner wasn't to his liking difficult. I found having no contact with the outside world difficult. Finch's smile didn't waver. Yet you never reported these alleged abuses to anyone, never sought help from neighbors or the authorities. There were no neighbors within 20 miles, Vivian countered. And I was never permitted to travel to town without Alistair's supervision. The questioning continued in this vein for nearly an hour, Finch attempting to portray Vivian as unstable, ungrateful, or simply unprepared for the realities of frontier life. She held her ground, answering each question truthfully despite the growing exhaustion and distress his relentless probing caused. Finally, Judge Wilson intervened. I believe Miss Kendrick has answered your questions thoroughly, Mr. Finch. Let us move on to Mr. Blackwood's testimony. Alistair took the stand with the confident air of a man accustomed to being believed. His version of events painted a vastly different picture: a generous man who had rescued a family from financial ruin, a devoted husband who had sought only to protect his delicate wife from the dangers of the frontier, a heartbroken spouse whose troubled wife had fled without explanation or cause. "I loved Vivian from the moment I met her," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "I would never have harmed her. These allegations, they pain me deeply. I can only assume that the trauma of her ordeal in the wilderness has confused her memories of our time together." It took all of Vivian's self-control not to cry out at the blatant lies. Beside her, she could feel Jake's tension, his barely contained anger at Alistair's distortions. When Alistair finished his testimony, Jake was permitted to question him. Despite his lack of legal training, Jake proved to be a formidable interrogator, his questions precise and targeted. "Mr. Blackwood, can you explain these banking records showing that you purchased the notes on Mr. Kendrick's business loans shortly before approaching him about marriage to his daughter?" Alistair's composure slipped slightly. Business transactions often precede social connections. There was nothing untoward about it. "And these letters to your business associate in New York, where you discuss securing the Kendrick girl and having the father in such a position that he cannot refuse, how do you explain those?" A flush of anger crept up Alistair's neck. "Business correspondence can often sound more calculating than the reality. I was merely expressing my hope to court Miss Kendrick successfully." Jake pressed on, methodically dismantling Alistair's claims of innocence and good intentions. When he finally asked about the remote cabin and why a man of Blackwood's means would choose to keep his wife so isolated, Alistair's control began to crack. "The frontier is no place for a woman without proper supervision," he snapped. "Vivian was naive, easily influenced. I sought only to protect her from unsavory elements." "Elements like Mr. Harrington," Judge Wilson interjected, his tone deceptively mild. Alistair's gaze flickered to Jake, naked hatred in his eyes. "I have no doubt that Mr. Harrington has taken advantage of my wife's vulnerable state to turn her against me. Perhaps he even engineered her escape for his own purposes." "That's a serious accusation," the judge noted. "Do you have evidence to support it?" "Only the evidence of my wife's dramatic change in attitude and her presence at his ranch," Alistair replied, struggling to regain his composure. "I believe his motives in this matter are far from altruistic." Jake started to respond, but Judge Wilson held up a hand. "Mr. Harrington's motives, whatever they may be, are not relevant to the question of whether the marriage was entered into under coercion or fraud. Let us stay focused on the matter at hand." The hearing continued for another hour, with Mr. Finch presenting character witnesses for Alistair business associates, who testified to his honesty and integrity. A physician who suggested that Vivian's allegations might stem from female hysteria, rather than actual abuse. Throughout it all, Vivian maintained her composure, though each lie, each distortion of the truth, cut like a knife. She drew strength from Jake's steadfast presence beside her, and from her own determination to be free of Alistair's control once and for all. Finally, Judge Wilson called a halt to the proceedings. "I have heard enough testimony and reviewed sufficient evidence to make my ruling," he announced. "However, given the complexity of the case and the serious nature of the allegations on both sides, I will take until tomorrow morning to consider my decision. Until then, the temporary restraining order remains in effect. Mr. Blackwood is to have no contact with Miss Kendrick, direct or indirect." Alistair's face darkened with anger, but he nodded stiffly. "As you wish, Your Honor, but I would request that Mr. Harrington be similarly restrained from influencing my wife further during this period." The judge considered this for a moment, then nodded. A fair point. Miss Kendrick, I will arrange for you to stay at the home of Mrs. Leeton, the widow of our former mayor. She often provides lodging for women involved in court matters. Mr. Harrington, you will refrain from contact with Miss Kendrick until after my ruling. Though the separation was the last thing either of them wanted, Jake and Vivian had no choice but to agree to the judge's terms. As the hearing adjourned, Jake managed to whisper a few words of encouragement before the court clerk led Vivian away. Be strong. It's almost over. I believe in you. Those words sustained her through the long, anxious night at Mrs. Leeton's house, where she paced the floor of her small room, replaying the day's events and trying to gauge whether the evidence had been enough to convince the judge. By dawn, exhaustion had finally claimed her, and she fell into a fitful sleep only to be awakened 2 hours later by Mrs. Leeton's gentle knock, informing her that it was time to return to the courthouse. The morning was overcast, the air heavy with the promise of rain as Vivian was escorted back to Judge Wilson's chambers. Jake was already there, his face showing signs of a similarly sleepless night. Across the room, Alistair sat with his attorney, his expression confident but with an underlying tension that Vivian recognized as barely controlled rage. Be seated, please, Judge Wilson instructed as he entered, carrying a sheaf of papers. His face gave no hint of his decision as he settled behind his desk. I have reviewed all testimony and evidence presented in this matter with great care, he began. Cases involving marital disputes are always difficult as they touch on the most private aspects of human relationships. When those disputes include allegations of coercion and abuse, the difficulty is compounded. He shuffled his papers, then looked directly at Vivian. Miss Kendrick has presented a compelling account of a marriage entered into under duress, followed by a pattern of controlling and abusive behavior. Her testimony is supported by documentary evidence that strongly suggests Mr. Blackwood deliberately manipulated her father's financial circumstances to create the conditions for coercion. Alistair shifted in his seat, his confidence visibly wavering. Mr. Blackwood, for his part, has denied these allegations and presented character witnesses who attest to his good reputation. However, the judge continued, his voice hardening, reputation is not character and public behavior often masks private actions. He set his papers down and folded his hands on the desk. After careful consideration of all factors, I find that the evidence supports Miss Kendrick's petition. The marriage was indeed entered into under conditions of coercion and fraud, rendering it invalid from its inception. Joy and disbelief flooded through Vivian in equal measure. Beside her, Jake exhaled sharply, his hand finding hers beneath the table. Furthermore, Judge Wilson continued, I find Mr. Blackwood's behavior during the marriage to constitute cruel and inhumane treatment, which would be grounds for divorce even if the marriage had been valid. Therefore, I hereby declare the marriage between Vivian Kendrick and Alistair Blackwood null and void. Miss Kendrick is, in the eyes of the law, an unmarried woman with all the rights and freedoms that status entails. Alistair surged to his feet, his face contorted with fury. This is outrageous. You have no jurisdiction. Sit down, Mr. Blackwood, the judge commanded, his voice like steel. I have not finished. In light of the evidence of your abusive behavior and your apparent unwillingness to accept Miss Kendrick's right to self-determination, I am extending the restraining order indefinitely. You are to have no contact with Miss Kendrick, to remain at least 100 yards from her at all times, and to make no attempt to compel her return through legal or other means. Violation of this order will result in your immediate arrest and imprisonment. Alistair's attorney placed a restraining hand on his client's arm, murmuring something that appeared to be a warning. After a moment of visible struggle, Alistair regained a semblance of control. "I will appeal this ruling," he said, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "This is not the end of the matter." Judge Wilson regarded him coolly. "You have the right to appeal, of course, but I suggest you consider carefully whether pursuing this matter further is in your best interest. The evidence presented here raises questions about your business practices that might interest authorities in Boston. Sometimes it is wiser to accept defeat gracefully and move on." The implied threat was clear, and something in Alistair's expression shifted calculation, replacing anger as he weighed his options. "This proceeding is concluded," the judge declared, rising from his seat. "Miss Kendrick, you are free to go. Mr. Blackwood, you will remain here for an additional 15 minutes to allow Miss Kendrick to depart without encounter." Outside the courthouse, in the privacy of a small garden at the rear of the building, Vivian finally allowed the tears she had been holding back to fall, not tears of fear or sorrow, but of overwhelming relief and joy. "It's over," she whispered as Jake gathered her into his arms. "I'm free." "Yes, you are," he murmured against her hair. "Free to choose your own path to build the life you want." Vivian pulled back slightly to look up at him, her heart so full it seemed impossible to contain all she was feeling. "The life I want is with you, Jake, if you still want me." His answer was to draw her closer, his lips finding hers in a kiss that held all the promise of the future they would build together, a future without fear, filled instead with love and the certainty that she would never again be alone. 3 months later, on a crisp October day with the aspen trees blazing gold against the blue Wyoming sky, Vivian stood in the garden behind Harrington Ranch, now abundant with the last harvest of the season. She wore a simple gown of ivory silk that Sarah had helped her make, a crown of wildflowers in her hair, and her mother's locket around her neck. Before her stood Jake, looking both nervous and joyful in a new suit, his usually unruly hair tamed for the occasion. Around them gathered the people who had become her new family, Sarah, and Dr. Wells with their children, Mrs. Abernathy, the ranch hands who had protected her, Pastor Thomas who had sheltered them, and even Judge Wilson, who had made a special trip from Laramie for the ceremony. "Dearly beloved," Pastor Thomas began, his voice carrying across the ranch yard where chairs had been set up for the small gathering. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Jacob Harrington and Vivian Kendrick in holy matrimony." As the familiar words of the ceremony washed over her, Vivian's mind briefly flashed back to another wedding. 2 years earlier, a somber affair in a Boston drawing room, with her father's defeated eyes and Alistair's triumphant smile. How different this day was, filled with genuine joy and freely given love. They had heard, 3 weeks earlier, that Alistair had returned to Boston, apparently having decided that pursuing Vivian further was indeed not in his best interest. Whether it was the judge's veiled threat about his business practices, or simply the recognition that he had been outmaneuvered, they couldn't be sure. But the knowledge that he had gone, that the shadow of his presence no longer hung over them, had allowed Vivian to plan their wedding with a light heart. "Do you, Jacob, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part?" Jake's blue eyes held her steadily, filled with a love that still amazed her. "I do." "And do you, Vivian, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part?" "I do," Vivian replied, her voice clear and certain, free of the fear that had been her constant companion for so long. They exchanged simple gold bands, Jake's hands warm and sure as he slipped the ring onto her finger. And when Pastor Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was a promise of love, of safety, of a future built together on the foundation of trust that had begun that night on the porch, when a cowboy had promised a frightened woman that she would never have to fear again. The celebration that followed was joyous but simple, with food prepared by Mrs. Abernathy and music provided by several of the ranch hands who played fiddle and guitar. As dusk fell, lanterns were lit around the yard, casting a warm glow over the gathering. "Mrs. Harrington," Jake murmured in Vivian's ear as they shared a quiet moment while their guests were busy with dessert. "How does it feel to have a new name?" Vivian smiled up at him, her heart full to bursting. "Wonderful, because this time it was my choice, my free choice." Jake's arms tightened around her. "I promise you, Vivian, you'll never regret that choice. I'll spend the rest of my life making sure of it." "I know," she said simply, believing it with every fiber of her being. "That's why I made it." As night fell fully and stars appeared in the vast Wyoming sky, Vivian looked around at the ranch that had become her home, at the people who had become her family, and at the man who had taught her to trust again. From the depths of despair, she had found her way to this moment of perfect happiness. The cabin where she had once been a prisoner was hundreds of miles and a lifetime away. In its place was this ranch house, filled with warmth and laughter, where doors were never locked and windows were left open to catch the summer breeze, where she was not a possession but a partner, where she was loved not for her beauty or her family name, but for her strength, her resilience, her true self. In the years that followed, as Harrington Ranch prospered and grew, as children came to fill the house with new laughter and joy, Vivian would sometimes look back on that desperate night when she had climbed through a broken window into the wilderness, not knowing if she would survive or what future awaited her if she did. And in those moments of reflection, she would always find Jake's eyes on her, understanding without words where her thoughts had gone. He would take her hand or pull her into his arms and whisper the promise he had made that first night on the porch, the promise he had kept every day since. "You're safe now, Vivian. You'll never have to be afraid again," and she wasn't, never again.